He shot the man in the back of the line first. Not the officer leading the charge, not the closest threat, the last one. The man. At the far end of a 6-man bayonet rush across 25 yards of broken French soil, a man who probably hadn't even realized yet what was about to happen to the soldiers in front of him. One shot, then the next farthest, then the next. By the time the German lieutenant at the front of that charge understood what was happening, 5 of his men were already dead behind him. He died last, all 6. Fell in under 10 seconds. 132 German soldiers surrendered that morning to a man from Tennessee who had written on his draft card, less than a year before, 4 words that said everything about who he was and nothing about who he was about to become. Don't want to fight. If you've never heard this story in full, or if you've only heard the headline, stay with me, because what happened in the Argonne Forest on October 8, 1918 is not simply a story about a great shot. It's a story about a man who resolved the deepest contradiction of his life in the worst possible place to resolve anything, and saved lives because of it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. We do this every week. The Argonne Forest is not the kind of place where legends get made easily. By the fall of 1918, it had already swallowed men whole for years. 60 square miles of dense ancient woodland sitting astride the Franco-German border, thick with oak and beech and the kind of undergrowth that hides everything, including the men trying to kill you. The French had been fighting over the edges of it since 1914. The Germans had turned it into a fortress, layered defensive positions, interlocking machine gun nests, natural choke points that funneled attacking infantry into killing grounds. You didn't advance through the Argonne. You bled through it. By September 1918, it had become the center of the final Allied push of the war, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. 1 million American soldiers, 47 days of fighting, nearly 120,000 American casualties before it ended. It was the largest military operation in United States history at the time, and it would remain the deadliest battle American forces ever fought. Into this forest, on the morning of October 8, 1918, came the 82nd Infantry Division, the All-American Division, so nicknamed, because its men had been drawn from every state in the Union, and among them, in Company G of the 328th Infantry Regiment, was a corporal from Fentress County, Tennessee, who was the best shot his officers had ever seen, and who, months earlier, had told those same officers he wasn't sure he could bring himself to fire at a human being. His name was Alvin York. To understand what York did that morning, you have to understand where he came from. Not just the geography, though the geography matters, but the whole of the map. He was born December 13, 1887, in a 2-room log cabin in Pall Mall, Tennessee. Pall Mall is not a place most Americans could find on a map today, and in 1887, it barely qualified as a place at all. It sat in the valley of the 3 forks of the Wolf River, tucked into the Cumberland Mountains near the Kentucky border, cut off from the larger world by terrain and poverty and the kind of self-sufficiency that made both bearable. Alvin was the 3rd of 11 children. His father, William, farmed and worked a smithy. His mother raised children and held the family together with the particular quiet strength of Appalachian women who had no alternative. There was no money for schooling beyond a few months a year. There was barely a school. What there was in abundance was the woods and the rifle. From the time Alvin could carry a gun, he hunted, not for sport, for food, squirrel, turkey, deer, whatever the forest offered. William York was, by his son's recollection, the best shot in the mountains, good enough that his neighbors often asked him to judge their shooting contests rather than compete in them. Alvin learned from watching his father and then surpassed him. By his teenage years, he could drop a turkey at 40 yards by shooting at the head, not the body, the head, because a body shot wasted meat. He learned something else from those years in the woods, something that would not become relevant for another 3 decades. When you're hunting turkeys in a flock, you never shoot the one at the front first. If you do, the others scatter. Before you can get a second shot, you start at the back, you work your way forward. The birds in front don't know what's happening until it's too late to run. In Tennessee, this was just good hunting practice. In the Argonne Forest, it would be the difference between living and dying. But before the forest, there was the man's soul. Alvin York, by his mid-20s, was in trouble. His father died of typhoid fever in 1911, leaving Alvin as the oldest son still at home, head of a household he had no real way to support. The blacksmith shop burned, the farming barely covered. Food? He worked road crews for $1.60 a day, back-breaking labor, that he spent on moonshine card games and brawls at the Blind Tiger saloons, straddling the Tennessee-Kentucky line. He was, by every account including his own, heading nowhere in particular and getting there fast. "I was most always spoiling for a fight," he admitted later. "What changed him was a woman and a bolt of lightning, though not quite in the order." The 1941 Gary Cooper movie suggests the woman was Gracie Williams. He fell for her at a church service. She was 14, he was in his mid-20s, which tells you something about rural Tennessee in the early 20th century, and pursued her with the kind of single-minded determination he'd previously reserved for shooting matches. Her family was not impressed. He needed to be a different man to have any hope. The lightning was more metaphorical than literal, though the story has its dramatic versions. What actually happened was simpler and stranger. One night in 1914, riding home drunk after a confrontation at a saloon, something broke open in York and didn't close. He walked into a church service and something in him heard it, differently than he ever had before. He stopped drinking, he stopped fighting, he joined the Church of Christ in Christian Union, a small, strict denomination that had roots in the region going back to before the Civil War, and that held as a matter of sincere conviction that its members should not take human life. Alvin York, the finest natural shot in his county, became a pacifist. So when the United States entered the Great War in April 1917 and the Selective Service Act went into effect, York did what his conscience required. He registered for the draft. On the form where it asked if he claimed exemption and on what grounds, he wrote simply, "Don't want to fight." His request for conscientious objector status was denied. Twice. The Church of Christ in Christian Union was not on the government's list of recognized pacifist denominations. His secondary claim that he was the sole support of his widowed mother was also denied. He reported to Camp Gordon, Georgia, in November 1917 and began training as an infantryman. And he was magnificent at it in spite of everything. On the rifle range, the Army targets, he said later, were so much bigger than turkeys' heads that hitting them felt almost too easy. He qualified as a sharpshooter quickly, his officers noticed, but the conflict in him was real. He had not resolved anything. He was learning to be a soldier with one part of his mind, while the other part wrestled with whether being a soldier was something God would forgive. 2 men in his chain of command took this seriously. His company commander was Captain Edward C.B. Danforth, Jr., a Georgia lawyer who was also a committed Christian. His battalion commander was Major George Edward Buxton, a newspaper editor from Providence, Rhode Island, who kept a Bible on his desk alongside his tactical manuals. When word reached them that their best marksman was a conscientious objector who was quietly in agony about the contradiction, they didn't dismiss him. They asked to talk. The conversation happened in Buxton's quarters, one light bulb hanging from the ceiling, 3 men on camp stools, Bibles in their laps. They traded verses. York would cite the commandments. Buxton and Danforth would respond with passages from the Old Testament, the prophets who went to war at God's direction, the armies of Israel. Neither side surrendered easily. The tone, York recalled later, was respectful throughout. "We didn't get annoyed or angry or even raise our voices," he said. "We just examined the old Bible." The discussion went on for an hour and a half. It didn't resolve, but it shifted something. Buxton gave York a 10-day furlough and sent him home to think. York went back to the mountains, back to the valley, back to the silence of the hills above Paul Mall. He knelt in the dirt and prayed through an entire night, into the next day, into the next night. And somewhere in those hours alone on a hillside he found something he hadn't been able to find in Georgia. A stillness, a conviction that didn't require him to choose between God and country because, as he came to understand it in those hours of prayer, they were not actually pointing in opposite directions. He came back from that leave and told Buxton he would go to war. "I began to understand," he wrote later, "that no matter what a man is forced to do, so long as he is right in his own soul, he remains a righteous man." He arrived in France in May 1918 and fought in the Saint-Mihiel offensive in September, where he distinguished himself and was promoted to corporal. By early October, his unit had been transferred to the Argonne sector. On the morning of October 8th, the fog sat thick over the valley. Rain the night before had soaked everything. The 328th Infantry Regiment had orders to advance across an open valley and push 2 kilometers into the forest to cut the Decauville Railroad, the main German supply artery running through the Argonne. Sever the railroad, and the German defensive line in the forest would collapse. The plan met reality almost immediately. As York's company crossed the valley, they came under devastating fire from German machine gun nests dug into the high ground on either side. The advance stalled. Men fell. The machine guns were elevated on the ridges, well concealed, and they swept the open ground with the methodical efficiency of weapons designed precisely for that purpose. The MG-08, Germany's standard heavy machine gun of the war, capable of firing 400 rounds per minute and covering an interlocking field of fire with other positions on the hillside. To break the deadlock, a small detachment was ordered to flank the position. 17 men under Sergeant Bernard Early worked their way around the German line, moving through the brush and trees at the base of the ridge, cutting behind the main defensive positions. They surprised a German regimental headquarters in the brush. The officers and men at the command post, caught completely off guard, surrendered. For a moment, the Americans had a large group of prisoners and believed they had neutralized the position. Then one of the captured German officers called out in German. The machine guns on the ridge opened fire. In the burst that followed, the guns killing men who were only 30 feet away. Sergeant Early went down with serious wounds. 8 Americans were killed or wounded in those first seconds. 3 other non-commissioned officers were down. Of the 17 men who had flanked the position, only 8 were still standing. And by seniority, command passed to Corporal Alvin York. What happened next is one of the most documented single-soldier actions in American military history, reconstructed not only from York's own diary and his Medal of Honor testimony, but from the German records of the 2nd Württemberg Landwehr Division, which were uncovered and analyzed by military historian Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Mastriano decades later. Both sides tell essentially the same story. York was on the right flank of the group, below the crest of the ridge in a small, natural depression in the hillside. This position gave him something invaluable. The angle was wrong for the machine guns to depress far enough to hit him. To aim at him, the German gunners had to raise their heads above the berm of their nests. Each time a head appeared, York shot it. He was using his M1917 Enfield rifle. He fired with the calm, unhurried precision of a man who had been shooting at small targets in the mountains since he was a child. He later estimated that he used 19 shots on 18 men. He didn't think he missed. The German machine gunners began to take cover. The weight of fire from the heights decreased. York moved, repositioned, kept shooting. The Germans on the ridge were fighting a man they could barely see, who didn't miss and who showed no signs of stopping. In the German lines, Lieutenant Paul-Jürgen Fulmer, a highly decorated officer from Ulm, who had been fighting on the Western Front since 1914 and who had recently assumed command of the 1st Battalion of the 120th Württemberg Landwehr Regiment, was trying to understand what was happening. He couldn't. His position was taking fire from what appeared to be a single man. Below the ridge, he tried to shoot York himself and missed. His machine gunners were dying or going to ground. Then came the bayonet charge. A German lieutenant and 5 soldiers jumped from a trench on the slope and came directly at York, 25 yards away, bayonets fixed, running. York had nearly exhausted the ammunition in his rifle's magazine. He dropped it and drew his .45 Colt automatic pistol, and he shot the man in the back of the line first. He said later, when reporters and generals and eventually the whole country asked him to explain, that he didn't stop to think about it. He just did it the way he'd always done it, the way his father had taught him, the way the Tennessee mountains had made him. That's the way we shoot wild turkeys at home, he explained, to anyone who would listen. You see, we don't want the front ones to know that we're getting the back ones, and then they keep on coming until we get them all. He also added, with the particular practicality of a man who had thought through every scenario. I knew too that if the front ones wavered or if I stopped, the rear ones would drop down and pump a volley into me and get me. The front man, the lieutenant, died last. All 6 fell in under 10 seconds, in reverse order of their distance from York's gun. Then York picked up his rifle and went back to work on the machine gun nests. Lieutenant Vollmer, watching all of this from further up the slope, had reached his limit. He called down from the ridge, "English?" He had once worked in Chicago. He knew the language. York called back, "No, not English." Vollmer said, "What?" York said, "American." "Good Lord," Vollmer said. And then he offered to surrender on condition that York stopped shooting. York pressed the barrel of his .45 against the back of Vollmer's head and said yes. Vollmer blew a whistle. German soldiers began coming down the hillside and out of the undergrowth, hands raised, 50, 70 more. They kept coming. One German, still uncommitted to surrender, threw a grenade. It went off, wounding several other Germans but missing York entirely. York and his remaining 7 men formed the prisoners into a column, with the German officers at the front, where any remaining snipers on the ridge would shoot their own men before they shot York. He made Vollmer march directly in front of him. They walked the prisoners back through the German lines, through terrain still contested, through positions that might have opened fire at any moment. York used the German officers as shields throughout, moving them forward whenever he suspected a threat. By the time they reached the American lines, the column numbered 132 prisoners. York and 7 men had captured an entire battalion's worth of enemy soldiers. They had seized 35 machine guns. His brigade commander, General Julian Lindsay, looked at the column and then looked at York and said, "Well, York, I hear you have captured the whole damned German army." York replied, "No, sir, I only have 132. He was promoted to sergeant on the spot. He would receive the Medal of Honor in April 1919, presented by General John J. Pershing, who called him the greatest civilian soldier of the war. The French Croix de Guerre followed, then the Italian Croce di Guerra, then the decorations from Montenegro. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the supreme Allied commander, said it was the greatest thing accomplished by any private soldier of all the armies of Europe. York went home to Tennessee and married Gracie Williams. He spent the rest of his life trying to build schools for the children of his valley and deflecting questions about the war. "I occupied one space in a 50-mile front," he told reporters who wanted the hero story. "I saw so little it hardly seems worthwhile discussing it. I'm trying to forget the war in the interest of the mountain boys and girls that I grew up among." Here is the thing about that moment with the 6 men on the bayonet charge. Every account, York's diary, the testimony at his Medal of Honor, investigation, the German records, the reconstructions by military historians, confirms that the reverse order shooting was not a calculated tactical decision made under fire. It was muscle memory. It was the Appalachian woods coming forward into the Argonne Forest without intermediary. A man who had learned to shoot by killing turkeys to feed his family used that exact same knowledge in that exact same way to keep himself alive in France. The turkeys had taught him the physics of it. You work back to front because the rear targets can't see the front targets fall, and the front target, the one who could sound the alarm, the one who could scatter the rest, dies last when it no longer matters. In the machine gun nests, he had applied a variant of the same logic. He shot the gunners who appeared above the berm one at a time, patient as a man shooting at a choke point in the woods, letting the terrain work for him the way terrain had always worked for him. He had spent his whole life learning to do exactly this in the mountains above Paris, Mall, for reasons that had nothing to do with war. And then one morning in France, it was everything. There is a photograph taken in October 1918, a few days after the Argonne action. It shows York standing in a field near Varennes-en-Argonne and the captured German officers lined up beside him. Lieutenant Vollmer is there, Lieutenant. Paul Lipp, who commanded the 125th Württemberg machine gun unit, is there. 3rd German officer stands slightly apart. York's expression in the photograph is not triumphant. It is the expression of a man who has come through something he is not entirely sure he should have survived, and who is already beginning the process of not talking about it. He would carry what happened in that forest for the rest of his life. He never wavered in his belief that God had protected him, for the bushes were shot up all around me and I never got a scratch. But he also never glorified it. He never sold it. When the 1941 film starring Gary Cooper made him an international celebrity all over again, he used the attention to raise money for his school in Tennessee. He suffered a cerebral hemorrhage in 1954 and spent his last 10 years bedridden, cared for by Gracie in Pall Mall. He died on September 2, 1964 at the Veterans Hospital in Nashville. He is buried in the Wolf River Cemetery in Pall Mall, Tennessee. The grave sits on a hillside above the valley where he was born, in sight of the same mountains where he learned to shoot. On his headstone, Sergeant Alvin C. York Medal of Honor. Nothing about turkeys, nothing about the Argonne. Just the rank he earned and the recognition he received on a hillside above the valley, where the man who earned them first learned to shoot from the back of the line forward without wasting a shot. If this story hit you, and I hope it did, consider subscribing. Stories like Yorks don't get told as often as they should, and there are hundreds more like it will be here every week.